Speaking of cool stuff, the Cardinals have really revamped, their wide receiver room. This point from last year, it was a lot of Hollywood Brown, Rondell Moore. Dortch was unfortunately an afterthought again, at least to start training camp.
Yeah.
And then Michael Wilson had to get his footing, even though he found it quickly. Cardinals have come a long way. We've got a graphic here breaking down this receiving room. When I look at this, Bo, is there a player that is an X factor outside of the top two? Is it a player that you look at a Zay Jones and a Chris Moore? Yeah, maybe not household names. What can they bring to this group that really has been overturned by Monty Austinford in a single offseason?
I hate to do this to you. I don't want to get too smart for the room.
Okay.
I just think if I go chalk, I think it's the right play. Like Marvin Harrison Jr., what he brings to the table, it completely transforms what the Arizona Cardinals want to do with their wide receiver room. It puts Michael Wilson, Greg Dortch in just great position to be successful out there on the field. And you can throw Trey McBride, the tight end, in that equation as well. It's just Marvin Harrison Jr. taking over the X wide receiver spot for this offense. It's going to transform things. And this was an offense that was playing yardage wise as a top 10 offense while Kyler Murray returned for the final 8 games of the season. And so many times we get on a post-game show and we can complain about the lack of wide receiver options and weapons for him. And now you don't have that issue any longer. You've got Marvin Harrison Jr., Greg Dortch, who did step up in those situations. And then Michael Wilson did develop that rapport in the final 2 games of the season. But, there was a lot of learning curves there in between. Now you've got, I think, a group that's poised to take off in Buffalo in week 1, like just from the very jump. And like MHJ is the easy answer, but it's the right answer. If you're asking me like for an X factor, as far as, who could maybe be maybe kind of the linchpin to a successful season for this group and could be their downfall at the same time. I mean, I think they put themselves in a good spot depth wise with the addition of Zay Jones, and everything I've heard, especially just from Jonathan Gannon himself, is saying he'll reiterate Zay Jones is a 3-position wide receiver. He can play all 3 spots, the X, the Z, the slot. And he's a guy that's going to be the primary backup, I think, for all 3 of the starting guys in MHJ, Michael Wilson, and Greg Dortch.
First of all, this graphic is fire because our producer extraordinaire, Damon, made it. I flubbed something up, though. There's no Zach Pascal on this graphic.
Yeah.
So you think about Andre Pachelia, Daniel Arias, Tayshaun Palmer, the 6th rounder out of UAB, and then Zach Pascal is somewhere in the proximity. I don't think he's cut. I think he's on the team. But then I look at somebody like Chris Morbo that they got, has spent time in Houston, played a lot of meaningful football for Tennessee last year, had over 400 yards. The common denominator is Palmer, over 6 foot, Chris Moore, 6'1", Zay Jones, 6 foot, 6'1.5". Maybe, is he 6'2"? I don't even know. It's only Greg Dortch and Andre that are undersized here. I think Chris Moore is a sleeper because he's an ace on special teams. He's also a pretty good blocking receiver. Could he come in and help this team as a rotational depth piece? I think, unfortunately, for Zach Pascal, the reason I forgot about him on the graphic is because they brought in multiple tall, big, lengthy receivers. Is there any way, Bo, knowing what he means to the locker room, his special teams prowess, is there any way Zach Pascal's not on this team this fall?
Yeah, I mean, he's not making that much money. I mean, he's not somebody that's, not expendable. I think like MHJ, Michael Wilson, Greg Dortch, Zay Jones, Chris Moore, you got 5 right there. And then, Pachelia is always in a rotating door from the practice squad to the active roster. And I think he'll start the season once again on practice squad. And Daniel Arias, that's a good spot for him as well. A 2nd-year undrafted player out of Colorado. Zay Weaver, also somebody that's down in this graphic that is an undrafted rookie free agent out of CU. And then Tayshaun Palmer is probably somebody that could be practice squad eligible. But I think with all the changes coming to special teams, on the kickoff and stuff, I think that there is going to be an emphasis outside of like your every down starting wide receivers for guys that are versatile. And Zach Pascal is always going to be able to lean on that.
He's had 19 yards last year in 14 games, 19 yards receiving. And we thought he'd play more of a focal point. Michael Wilson, they had other plans. And when they were desperate for receivers, Pascal was not an option outside of, the occasional run block. So Zach Pascal is going to need to have a really strong training camp covering kicks, kickoff return, punt coverage, whatever, gunner, whatever he plays. And then obviously he's a staple in the locker room at 29 years old. Because I think obviously there's a huge gap between, and Damon Dog on the fly because he's an elite producer, adding Zach Pascal to this graphic. I think there's a huge drop off after Zay Jones. I mean, we asked Tayshaun Palmer. He said Zay Jones is one of the fastest players on the team. I said, how fast is Marv? He said, he's fast. Zay Jones is fast. So you look at Marv, Michael, Greg Dortch, Zay Jones, and then you couple that with an elite tight end in Trey McBride, Higgy Bear, the second round or the 6th round pick, the second-year player, converted wide receiver tight end out of Stanford. So there's some size and some depth. And then they took a tight end in the top 100 picks. Like, there's 3 capable tight ends and 4 capable wide receivers. And then we just talked about a plethora of backs. Like, it's going to be a chore for Chris Moore, Zach Pascal, and otherwise to see time offensively. It just is. So again, like, that's why I'm surprised. Like, Chris Moore, who had options, he had over 400 yards receiving last year. He had almost 20 yards per carry. He had options, Bo, and he chose to sign here. So it's interesting. This bottom group now, with how little they play, 3 and 4 receiver sets, like, what is it for those guys this year?
Yeah, I mean, look, they still played over 60% of their offense in 11 personnel. Like, and that's traditionally, you've got the 2 outside wide receivers in your slot. So, but the thing to look forward to in training camp, and you hope that the coaching staff doesn't have to be banged over the head again for a 3rd consecutive season, is Greg Dortch should be your primary slot. As encouraged as you are, as tantalizing as it is to see the size, the athleticism from Zay Jones, and also, you can look back at his statistics, and the receipts are there as well, that he's a productive wide receiver in this league. I think you pay the respect to Greg Dortch and let him hold on to that spot. But I think, if they are still going to play about 60% of their snaps in 11 personnel, will they swap out a Zay Jones? So, does he kind of give you more upside as far as blocking in the slot than maybe a Greg Dortch? Or, like, he's going to be the primary backup to get in there. And I think, sure, he's 4th on the depth chart for this wide receiver room, but I don't think he's going to lack in snaps. Like, I think he's going to be a high-end backup for this Cardinals wide receiver core. And I think that's probably how they sold him, how they, were able to pry him away, where he had visits with the Cowboys and the Chiefs before signing with Arizona.
Pretty wild. I do think, to your point, like, most of their sets offensively last year, 2 and 3 receiver sets. Do you think we see more with the now arrival of Kyler Murray for 17 games, you hope, and the addition of Marvin Harrison Jr.? Is there going to be a temptation to get receivers on the field more, especially when you have to have these games early on in the season where you're going to be asked to put up 30-plus points per game? Like, I hope there's not too much of a hesitation to get away from what they do well, like we talked about in the first segment, and running the football. But at the same time, like, you're down 10 points in the second half, and you got to get back to base here. You got 4 wide receivers who are certainly capable, and that's not even including Trey McBride.
Right. Yeah, I mean, tip of the cap to Monty Ossenfort for flipping this room.
Yeah.
I mean, let's talk about the personnel where it was at this time last year. Like,
well, that's the biggest point, is how cheap now this room is.
If it's cheap, sure. Yeah. And it was one of the most expensive in the league. It was ridiculous. Like, you were paying DeAndre Hopkins to go away so you could absorb that and not have to pay any more cap tax on that beyond last season. And, Hollywood Brown on his 5th-year option, which was not cheap. But, like, you had Hollywood Brown as your starting X, 5'9". You had Rondell Moore as your starting slot, 5'7". And I know, like, Greg Dortch is coming in, but he was part of that as well. You had 3 players that were under 6 feet. It's not the case any longer. So, like, I think you might see an uptick in 11 personnel just because you've got more wide receivers that are physically capable of blocking and being involved in the run game, where last year you didn't necessarily have that option. But then, like, you look at what they did to the tight end room, and, like, you could see some 12. You could see, especially in close, some more 13 personnel. But I think that primarily you'll see mostly 11, like you did. And you just have guys like Michael Wilson and Marvin Harrison Jr. It seems like all signs are pointing to him embracing his role in the run game, where guys, like, they might have embraced it, but physically they just couldn't, keep up with NFL defenders because they were too small.
Marv, by the way, their highest paid receiver on his rookie deal, $6.4 million per year cap hit this year, according to our friends at overthecap.com. The second highest paid receiver on the Arizona Cardinals, the aforementioned, I believe, Zach Pascal. Zay Jones making just about $2 million. Chris Moore's at $2 million. Michael Wilson's at $1.2 million. Our guy Greg Dortch right around $1 million as well. So again, they've certainly figured out, at least temporarily, how to field that room with a bunch of savvy vets and cheap talent via the draft. And it's a good problem to have eventually if you want to pay Michael Wilson, of course, Marvin Harrison Jr., and then, Greg Dortch got another year of eligibility.
As excited as we are on this wide receiver room, where do you think it stacks up in the NFC West? Because I had Damon Dog compile the top wide receivers from each of the 4 teams in the NFC West, and it is probably the most impressive collection of wide receivers in the entire league. You can see it visually. Puka had an unbelievable rookie season, over 1,400 yards receiving. We'll see. Like Damon and I were talking about this. Cooper Kupp, he's 31 years old, battle injuries after his Triple Crown winning season a couple of years ago. And then we'll throw Tutu as their third. Like that's an open competition.
He's trash.
And if Cooper Kupp isn't, like Damon, you were saying this, if Cooper Kupp has another bad year, like you could move them down.
Hypothetically to last, I would say.
Yeah.
The margins are really thin on these lists here. Like you got a lot of good receivers.
Same thing goes for San Francisco, right? Like I like their depth. I forgot that they took Jacob Cowing and Ricky Pearsall, like nice depth youth behind like the top receivers like Ayuk. Like he's posting over the weekend picks from the Commanders, practices. He's still at odds with the organization, but he's 26. If they iron something out, like immediately he's their deep threat. And then Debo at 28, like a lot of wear and tear on his body. Like he could always miss significant time. And then you've got, pretty consistent receiving core. DK only 26, and Smith and Jigba is, I think he's an emerging star soon.
Yeah. Debo Samuel, I think this is his last year in San Francisco. So if you fast forward to next year, it's Ayuk on a big money contract, and then some unknowns. Like Juwan Jennings is just a guy. I mean, he's a nice contributor as a 7th rounder, but he's not a starting caliber receiver. And if Ricky Pearsall busts, that receiving group kind of goes backwards. I think you've got a really good chance to supersede any of these teams, frankly. Lockett's old.
Really got the highest upside of any of these groups.
Yeah, I mean, Metcalf and Smith and Jigba, I think by default are going to be hampered by their quarterback. I don't think Geno Smith is any good. I think you those 2 players are good. I like both those players a lot. I think you're going to be hampered by your QB. I'm at no point ready to doubt Sean McVay and his ability to make players. Like nobody had Puka Nacua on their radar last year. He was a nobody afterthought, 5th round pick or whatever he was. So like, I'm just going to sit here and pretend like if Cooper Kupp's gone, he's just going to find somebody else. Like I think that highly of Sean McVay. So I think the Cardinals are going to be in position to take over 2 or 3 next year. With Marvin, here's what I will say, having the potential to be the best receiver on this list. Like I think if we're going to include Marvin Harrison Jr. and the likes of Justin Jefferson and Devontae Adams and CeeDee Lamb, top 5 to 7 receivers in the NFL, like who's on par with that outside of Puka Nacua, who again, I like, but he's not. Marv is projected to be a top 5 receiver, and I don't see top 5 receivers on that list.
Yeah. It is clearly the best division for wide receivers. It's tough to think of one that top to bottom is stacked as the NFC West, but the Cardinals certainly on the rise. I like that point. Like MHJ, if he is who many people believe he can be, top 5 wide receiver in this league caliber, like it elevates it, and it quickly would elevate it to the top of the division, which would be huge, like the Arizona Cardinals.